What it do, homies? It's your boy Dave, and I'm back today. We out here with a simple history reaction. This time we're checking out the real Battle Royale Squid game. That title immediately caught my attention. Anyways, the Nazino Island tragedy of 1933. I am extremely interested. Let's go ahead and shut up and turn it up.
This video is brought to you by our sponsor, NordVPN.
I like his voice. This video is brought to you by our sponsor, NordVPN. I would like to do a narration for stuff like this, maybe sometime in the future.
Have you ever received a suspicious link or
Oh, this is an ad. I use NordVPN. I do use it. Okay, you already have a customer.
for only
For the
$3.16 a
last
month?
3 years.
The real-life battle royale, Nazino, Russia, 1933.
Nazina.
On May 18, 1933, on the direct orders of Stalin himself, 5,000 men and women arrived at Nazino, a small isolated island on the river Orb, deep in the remote and barren wilderness of western Siberia.
You know, I always wondered, with all the technology and stuff that we have available today, it's crazy, right? The amount of islands that either are not discovered or have very, very little surveillance that allows things. I mean, obviously, this was done in another country. You know, I'm here in the US, so we wouldn't have any business over there anyways. But still, the remote islands that people can take other people to do stuff like this, like that's crazy.
Within a matter of weeks, 4,000 of them would either just die from exposure, disappear, drown, or be eaten. This was the real-life battle royale. The Soviet Union was a miserable place to live during this period, with severe food shortages which resulted in millions of people dying of starvation. Any form of criticism of the state was dealt with brutally, where the offender would probably get a life sentence and be sent to a gulag.
Look, my history knowledge sucks. That's the reason why I started doing Sabaton reactions and now diving into simple history. You think your freedom of speech is being like censored right now? Imagine saying one thing and being sentenced a life.
Where they would literally be worked to death carrying out hard labor.
Oh my.
Stalin's purge of the so-called socially harmful elements of society mainly concentrated on certain groups, such as the Cossacks, ethnic minorities, intellectuals, and the kulaks, who were peasants who owned their own land and were sometimes hesitant in contributing a share of their goods to the common collective. Even the armed forces were not exempt, as mass purges were commonplace, which normally resulted in the execution of its most experienced officers. The Nazino settlers also included a wide cross-section of urban society, not just criminals and vagrants, but also regular workers, children, and pensioners. Many were taken simply because they had failed to obtain an internal passport. However, others included a party member who had stepped out of her apartment without her party card, a worker buying cigarettes who had left his passport at home, a 12-year-old girl waiting at a train station while her mother bought bread, as well as the pregnant wife of a naval officer and a 103-year-old man. None of them were pioneers ready to settle and farm a harsh and unforgiving land.
Oh my goodness, bro. They was just taking people just left and right. Yo, this was 1933, so 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So they'd be around. I wonder if there's any survivors, not obviously of this, but people who might have read about this in the news or saw it on, not people, read about it in a newspaper. They would be 90-something years old, right? Almost 100, if my math is correct. Man, this is brutal.
In February 1933, the head of the secret police, Genrik Yagoda, and the head of the Gulag labor camp system, Matvey Berman, got together and approached Stalin with a plan to resettle 2 million of these people into what was thought to be the vast area of untapped natural resources in Siberia and Kazakhstan. However, the environment was harsh and extremely cold, and much of the area was tundra and frozen all year round. Even when it did thaw out in the summer, the ground became swampy and infertile and unsuitable for any kind of agriculture. To add to this, the air would have been thick with mosquitoes. One of the areas that was chosen for the project was Nazino Island, which was on the north bank of the Orb River, deep inside the Siberian wilderness.
So not necessarily undiscovered, as I said, it just wasn't inhabited. Okay.
The island was only ever visited by the local Ostiak people
Oh.
from the nearby village of Nazino to gather tree bark to use as firewood. It was relatively small, measuring just 2 miles or about 3.2 kilometers long,
That
and
is small.
650 yards or 595 meters wide, and mostly made up of inhospitable swampland. Hunting and foraging was going to be nearly impossible. Many thousands of the so-called undesirables, which also included hardened and petty criminals by now, were being held in overcrowded prisons in Moscow and Leningrad. So, in the spring of 1933, they were loaded into all sorts of railway carriages, which included cattle trucks, and began a 10-day journey to Tomsk, where the half-completed transit camps were waiting for them. During the journey, gangs of criminals systematically beat up and robbed their fellow passengers. On May 14, 1933, after the prisoners had been processed and selected, 5,000 of these settlers set off on their journey to Nazino Island. They were loaded onto river barges that had only been designed to carry timber down the River Orb and were only given 200 grams of bread each a day for the
Bro, you loading, they was timber? Like, that's crazy. Does that mean at any point, because I know weight distribution on ships is like extremely important, but that seems pretty risky, especially if you put in, the officers and stuff on it. Let's see, timber can get pretty heavy, so maybe it's not an issue.
a 5-day journey. By the time they had arrived at Nazino, 30 people had died on the barges, and a third of them were too weak to even stand. The authorities had failed to provide any form of shelter on the island, nor any basic tools or building materials to construct basic shelters against the elements. On their first night there, it snowed heavily, and almost 300 people had frozen to death by the morning from exposure.
My goodness.
This happened every night, and some people were actually burned alive from laying too close to the campfires that they had made to try to keep themselves warm. 20 tons of flour had been left on the island for the settlers, but straight away fights broke out when guards tried to distribute it daily, and they ended up firing at the mob to break them up. As no ovens were available there to make bread or anything else, the settlers either ate the flour raw or mixed it with dirty water from the river.
Oh, yo, yeah, man. If you ever need to be woke up and humbled very quickly, I'm a humble guy, I'm thankful for everything that I have, and I try every day to not take advantage of the fact that I have even the most basic of the necessities, like the fact that I could put on socks, that within itself is a blessing. The fact that I can have water whenever I want is a blessing, right? So, but you watch stuff like this, and it definitely should be making you extremely humble, because this is next level stuff. Like,
and this led to an outbreak of dysentery. Daily fighting soon broke out over whatever resources were still available, and killings became commonplace, and the bodies were robbed of any possessions they had, including money and especially gold fillings and crowns from their mouths. To add to all this misery, 9 days later, another 1,200 settlers arrived on the island, and very quickly groups of rival gangs started to form, and murder and extortion became commonplace. In desperation, many of the settlers tried to construct crude rafts out of pieces of wood that they could find to flee the island, but they were so basic that they were not fit for purpose, and they just sank.
Hypothermia.
So they simply drowned in the ice-cold river, and their bodies were washed up on the shore along the River Orb. If they did manage to reach the opposite bank of the river alive, the guards would go and hunt them down for sport, and no questions were ever asked as to what had happened to them. Because of the lack of sanitation, there was soon an outbreak of typhus, which many succumbed to because of their already weak state of health.
Typhus.
But far worse was to come, because within a week, a doctor discovered cases of cannibalism beginning to appear on the island as people became desperate to find something to eat.
Yeah, that's those basic animal instincts, right? Kind of taking over.
It started out with cutting slices of flesh from the dead corpses and cooking them, but then progressed to killing people who were so weak or were so close to death, and therefore so vulnerable and unable to defend themselves. When one survivor was asked if he had eaten human flesh while on the island, he replied that he had only eaten livers and hearts, and then only from people who were dying anyway. Another incident involved a young woman who was having a relationship with one of the guards. When he was not around to protect her, some men tied her to a tree, killed her, and cut off everything from her body that they could eat. Despite the many arrests and executions by the guards, the situation was brought under control when, after a damning internal report was submitted, it was decided to abandon the settlement on Nazino Island only after a month after it had been set up.
That many people at the...
Approximately 1/3 of the settlers had died, while another third were reported as missing, possibly escaped, drowned, or eaten. Just over 2,000 people had survived.
He's already dead.
Unknown to the settlers at the time, all of their hardships had been in vain, as back in Moscow there had been a change in policy, and Stalin and the authorities had decided to cancel the whole settler experiment program. There was an official investigation into the Nazino incident, but the findings were never made public at the time. Several local officials and guards were given short prison sentences or dismissed from office. In the mid-1980s, the human rights group Memorial made the details of their findings public after they had investigated the episode themselves. A memorial cross was placed on the island in 1993 to remember those who had lost their lives there. The inscription on its plaque reads, "To the victims of political repression, 1933 to 1993. And every June, the local villagers from Nazino cross the river and place a wreath on the memorial."
Oh, it's nice. Oh my goodness, man, that's more brutal than the movie. Yo, and this apparently this is facts right here. This ain't there's nothing fiction about this. Oh, I did not expect this to get that dark. I mean, I know there's some Squid Game. I don't sit there and thinking of, you know, people, nefarious people putting other people in games and everything, but no, and it was just an experiment. Like they was just like, all right, we're done, and then just pretty much. Yeah, this was a lot darker than I thought it'd be. It's the type of stuff that I need to make sure I rate properly when I upload it to my YouTube channel. Okay. All right. That's the end of this video. If you enjoyed the content, leave a like and subscribe. Dave's out.